There's a moment most people never talk about. Quiet, subtle, but soul-rattling. You're sitting in a room filled with familiar faces, old friends, colleagues, maybe even family. And then it hits you, not like a shout, but like silence. You don't belong here anymore. The jokes feel rehearsed, the stories feel dated. The energy that once felt warm now feels like air without oxygen. You smile, you nod, you even laugh, but something deep inside you knows. Something has changed, and it's not them, it's you. Carl Jung believed this eerie shift is not a sign of social failure, but of inner awakening. It's not that you've become cold, it's that you've become conscious. The moment you stop betraying yourself to maintain old bonds, the disconnection begins, not out of malice, but out of misalignment. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung wrote, is to become who you truly are. But what he didn't always say out loud was that this privilege has a cost. You might outgrow the tribe that once gave you safety. Let me tell you a story. There was a man named Jordan who had always been the glue in his group of friends. The funny one, the fixer, the listener. He played the role so well that no one ever asked him how he really felt. For years, he laughed off his own needs. Until therapy cracked him open, he began setting boundaries, saying no when he meant no, speaking up when he disagreed. At first, he thought his friends would be proud. Instead, they called him distant, said he was changing, said he was too sensitive. What really happened was this. Jordan's growth demanded honesty, and their comfort depended on his silence. Jung believed that people live within psychic systems, and those systems resist change. The moment you evolve, when your language, values, or presence no longer match the pattern, your old world begins to push back. Not out of cruelty, but out of confusion. They don't know what to do with this new version of you. Because you've removed the glue, and now the structure trembles. The most painful part, you might still love them, you might still laugh with them, but underneath, there's a crack, a quiet knowing that the relationship is being held together by history, not truth, and this emotional dissonance grows louder the more you align with your true self. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of separating your inner identity from the outer masks you were taught to wear. And as you begin this journey, the first signal often isn't a dream or a journal entry. It's this, the uncanny feeling that you no longer fit into rooms you once called home. The irony is cruel. You might feel most alone when you're finally becoming whole. But Jung would remind us, it is in the moment of disconnection that your real life begins. The old you dissolve. The performance drops. The soul speaks, and you listen. And as you sit in that room, half smiling, half aching, you might wonder, why does it feel like I'm drifting? But the real question is this: when did I stop pretending? Because the truth is, the disconnection didn't start today. It started the day you stopped betraying yourself to keep the peace. This moment of drifting is not an ending, it is the beginning of seeing yourself clearly again. There comes a moment when simply walking into a room feels like stepping into a role you never auditioned for, but have played for years. You smile at the same people, laugh at the same jokes, offer the same polite nods, but something inside you no longer feels real. It's as if your soul is watching from behind a glass wall, whispering, "This isn't who we are anymore." Carl Jung called this false self the persona, the mask we construct to survive society's expectations. It's not deceitful, it's protective. A coping strategy built piece by piece through childhood and reinforced by the rewards of fitting in. But as your inner world deepens, that mask becomes brittle. It doesn't break all at once. It cracks slowly, painfully, until the pressure of your own authenticity bursts through. Take James, a quiet employee in a tech firm. For 7 years, he was the agreeable guy, never challenged a bad idea, always stayed late, smiled through mistreatment. His manager called him dependable. His co-workers called him chill. But inside, James was choking on his own silence. He had ideas. He had insights. But the fear of disrupting the status quo kept him in line. Until one meeting changed everything. The company was about to roll out a risky update that would affect millions of users. And James, feeling something shift inside him, finally spoke up. Not a whisper, but a calm, clear objection. The room went silent. No applause, no gratitude, just awkward glances, confusion, subtle distance in the days that followed. Why? Because the James they relied on had vanished. The mask had fallen, and no one knew what to do with the real man standing in his place. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But that privilege often begins with loss. Not just of the roles you've played, but of the relationships that only existed because of them. When you outgrow your persona, you don't just shock others, you disorient them. The person they liked was, in part, a reflection of their own comfort, their own expectations. When that reflection changes, it threatens the unspoken agreements that kept the relationship in balance. They may call you distant dramatic, selfish, but you're not breaking connection. You're breaking a contract that said, "I'll keep pretending if you keep accepting the pretend." The dramatic irony is this. We build personas to connect, but they often disconnect us from ourselves. You might have been the funny one, but the humor hid pain. The reliable one, but reliability came at the cost of self-abandonment. The calm one, but that calm was silence under pressure. And when you finally let go of the mask, the people who depended on it feel like they've been betrayed, but they weren't betrayed. They just never truly knew you. And that realization is devastating, not just for them, but for you. Because you begin to see how much of your life was spent performing to be liked, rather than living to be whole. And yet, this is the moment individuation begins, the sacred process of becoming your authentic self. Not the version shaped by reward or punishment, not the one that kept you safe in school, at work, or in family dynamics, but the one that whispers in your dreams, that stirs when you speak the truth, that aches when you betray yourself for approval. Individuation is not glamorous, it's not instantly freeing, it's disorienting, lonely, and at times deeply painful, but it is necessary, because the mask may win you applause, but only the real self can give you peace. As you evolve, expect resistance. Expect silence where there was once applause. Expect suspicion where there was once praise. But also expect something else. Clarity. The deeper you move into your truth, the more clearly you'll see who was there for the performance, and who is willing to stay for the soul. This is the beginning of a new kind of connection, not based on who you pretend to be, but on who you've fought to become. You feel disconnected because the mask they loved is gone, and the person beneath it has finally started breathing. There's a moment in growth that feels more like a curse than a blessing, the moment when your transformation becomes a mirror, not just for you, but for everyone around you. You didn't ask to be their reflection. You didn't ask to shine a light. But suddenly, your evolution unsettles the people who once felt safe around you. And the more conscious you become, the more uncomfortable they become, because your clarity starts to reveal the fog they're still hiding, and Carl Jung called this the shadow, the unconscious part of the psyche that stores everything we deny, suppress, or are too afraid to admit about ourselves. Not just our wounds, but our laziness, our bitterness, our envy, our unfulfilled potential. And when you start confronting your own shadow, you unintentionally make others confront theirs. Imagine a man named Ray. For years, Ray and his best friend Jordan had a ritual. They'd meet every Friday night, crack open beers, and complain about life, about politics, about their jobs. It was bonding through bitterness, a shared language of blame. But something changed. Ray started therapy. He stopped drinking. He began journaling, taking morning walks, and talking about accountability instead of blame. The first time he gently challenged one of Jordan's rants with, "But don't you think we play a part in that too?" Jordan froze, laughed, then grew defensive. "You sound like one of those self-help gurus now." It was supposed to be a joke, but it wasn't funny. The next week, Jordan cancelled. Then again, and again, until the silence became permanent. At first, Ray thought he'd done something wrong, but he hadn't betrayed Jordan. He had simply stopped betraying himself. The truth? Jordan wasn't mad at Ray. He was mad at the part of himself Ray was now forcing him to see. The part that stayed stagnant, the part that didn't want to change, the part that preferred the comfort of misery over the discomfort of growth, Jung once wrote. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That is the terrifying power of the shadow. It acts without asking, and when someone else starts working with the shadow, it can feel like an attack. Your new boundaries feel like judgment. Your health feels like rejection. Your calm feels like distance. But none of it is personal. It's psychological. They're not reacting to you. They're reacting to the part of them that doesn't want to evolve, and that is why the relationship begins to fracture. This is projection in its purest form. When you grow, you stop feeding their illusions. You stop validating their victimhood, and in doing so, you become the problem. You haven't grown bitter, you've grown inward. You haven't become distant, you've become defined. But they can't see that, because to see it would mean facing the truth about themselves. And so, they retreat. There's a kind of eerie irony here. The more light you find in yourself, the more darkness it reveals in others. Not because they are evil or malicious, but because they haven't yet begun their own work, and your evolution feels like exposure. Think of a colleague who always got by through charm, jokes, or gossip. Now you no longer engage. You no longer laugh. You no longer look for approval. Suddenly, they feel judged, when really, you've simply stepped out of the performance. This disconnection isn't loud, it's subtle, but it stings. Because deep down, you hoped they'd grow with you. You hoped your transformation would inspire, not intimidate. But transformation is lonely when the people around you prefer the mask you used to wear. Jung believed that growth requires us to withdraw projections, to stop blaming others for what is unhealed in us. But that process comes with a cost. People will blame you when you stop carrying their emotional debris. And unless they begin their own work, they'll call your healing a betrayal. So what do you do when your truth triggers someone else's denial? You let it, because your responsibility is not to protect others from their shadow, it's to stop letting yours run your life. Sometimes the moment you evolve becomes the moment others retreat, not from you, but from their own shadow. There comes a haunting moment when you realize the world around you no longer feels like home, not because it changed, but because you did. Conversations that once felt rich now feel like echoes. Crowds that once comforted you now leave you strangely hollow. You start noticing how everyone's still laughing at the same old jokes, chasing the same validation, wearing the same social armor. But you're no longer playing the part. Something inside has shifted. And in that subtle, silent shift, disconnection blooms. You're not better than them, but you're not in the same psychological room anymore. Carl Jung described this moment as the early stage of individuation, the beginning of separating who you truly are from who you were conditioned to be. It's when the outer structure of your life, friends, family roles, social obligations, can no longer contain the inner architecture that's quietly forming within. You feel like a guest in your own routine, like a familiar house with all the furniture rearranged. You go to dinner with an old friend and suddenly feel like you're speaking different languages. You nod, smile, even laugh. But inside, a whisper rises, "I don't belong here anymore." not because of conflict, but because of clarity. Jung believed the psyche revolts when it's forced to live beneath its potential, and that revolt often begins in silence. Imagine a man named Isaac. For years, he played the loyal friend to Marcus, the group's loud, self-absorbed joker who dominated every conversation. Isaac had always been the patient listener, the peacemaker, the soft-spoken one. But recently, Isaac started reading Jung. He started journaling, meditating, reflecting on his childhood wounds. And without warning, he began saying less and observing more. One evening, Marcus mocked a mutual friend in their usual joking way, but Isaac didn't laugh. He simply said, "That wasn't kind." The room went quiet. No one clapped. No one applauded the insight. They stared like he'd broken something. And he had. The social script. This is the ache of outgrowing your own life. Jung once said, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate. It oppresses." Isaac wasn't condemning Marcus. He was simply no longer willing to participate in unconscious cruelty, and that shift created friction. Because when your inner world grows, your outer world begins to shrink until it reinvents itself. But there's another layer the body knows before the mind accepts. Before you admit something's off, you might feel it in your chest, a strange weight in conversations, an irritation in familiar places, a numbness where joy used to be. You scroll social media not with interest, but obligation. You reply to texts with a sigh. You go out and wonder why it feels like acting. These aren't signs of depression, they're symptoms of evolution. Your psyche is inviting you into a deeper life, and the price of admission is letting the old life unravel. This is the ache of outgrowing your own life. Jung once said, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." Isaac wasn't condemning Marcus. He was simply no longer willing to participate in unconscious cruelty. And that shift created friction. Because when your inner world grows, your outer world begins to shrink until it reinvents itself. But there's another layer. The body knows before the mind accepts. Before you admit something's off, you might feel it in your chest, a strange weight in conversations, an irritation in familiar places, a numbness where joy used to be. You scroll social media, not with interest, but obligation. You reply to texts with a sigh. You go out and wonder why it feels like acting. These aren't signs of depression, they're symptoms of evolution. Your psyche is inviting you into a deeper life, and the price of admission is letting the old life unravel. There is a bittersweet irony in this phase. You don't hate the people around you. You don't even want to leave, but every time you ignore the misalignment, it costs you a piece of your authenticity. You start to shrink to fit again. You laugh to blend in. You agree when your body wants to say no. And each time, something in you tightens, a tension that eventually becomes unbearable. The people around you may not understand. They'll say you're pulling away, changing, or getting distant. But they won't see the truth. You're not running from them. You're walking toward yourself. The conversations haven't changed, but your soul has. And once your soul tastes truth, it won't return to noise. Carl Jung warned us that the soul has seasons, and just like the tree must shed its leaves to grow deeper roots, so too must we let go of outer approval to gain inner peace. The mismatch you feel with the world is not a failure, it's a signpost. A quiet knock from the self asking, "Are you ready to live a life that finally fits the truth inside you?" The distance you feel from the world is a sign that your inner world is asking you to move toward who you were meant to become. There's a quiet betrayal that doesn't begin with lies or cruelty, but with healing. One day, you realize the person who once knew you best no longer understands who you are becoming. The space between you grows, not because you are walking away, but because you are walking inward. Carl Jung warned that many relationships are formed not through truth, but through mutual projections. We don't always love someone for who they are, we often love them for what they reflect back to us. And when the mirror changes, so does the bond. Imagine Liam and Evan. Friends since high school, they shared everything, inside jokes, late-night talks, complaints about life. But much of their closeness was rooted in pain. They bonded over absent fathers, self-doubt, and relationships that never lasted. It felt deep, but it was actually wounded. Then Liam started therapy. He began reading Jung, journaling, setting limits. He no longer laughed off Evan's sarcastic jabs. He didn't rush to rescue Evan from his crises. He became quieter, more centered. Evan felt it instantly, though he couldn't name it. The friend who once gave him emotional shelter was now a boundary. He called Liam distant. He said, "You've changed." And he was right, but not in the way he thought. According to Jung, healing is often the withdrawal of unconscious energy from a projection. When Liam began reclaiming his emotional power, he unknowingly pulled his projection off Evan. That is, Liam stopped needing Evan to reflect his worth. He no longer needed to play the role of emotional fixer. The problem is, Evan still did. And now, the mirror was gone. This is why some friendships collapse not in argument, but in confusion. The balance shatters. One person starts growing, the other feels abandoned. But there was no betrayal, only evolution. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But this also means that when someone stops playing their old role, we are forced to meet the parts of ourselves we've ignored." Evan wasn't angry at Liam for healing. He was angry that Liam's healing exposed how stagnant he had become. The friendship, once a refuge, became a confrontation, and Evan wasn't ready. He accused Liam of being fake positive, of acting superior. But beneath it all was grief, the kind you feel when someone leaves a role you secretly depended on. The great irony of spiritual or psychological growth is that the more you reclaim your truth, the more misunderstood you become, especially by those who once saw you as their emotional twin. They don't know how to meet the new you, because they never met themselves. And yet, you cannot return to the mask just to soothe their fear. Some people aren't meant to walk with you into healing, not because they are bad, but because they are unready. They mistake your silence for distance, your boundaries for rejection, your new calm for coldness. You try to explain, but explanation feels like betrayal of your own soul. You can't drag someone into depth if they're clinging to the surface, and you shouldn't have to. So you mourn, not just the friendship, but the version of you who needed it. That version was never false. It was survival. But now, you're learning to live. And that means walking some roads alone. Jung believed individuation, the journey toward wholeness, was not a path of comfort, but of courage. It requires breaking old energetic contracts that once kept you small, agreeable, needed. When you grow, you violate those contracts, and some will never forgive you for no longer abandoning yourself to stay close to them. The story of Liam and Evan isn't rare. It's happening everywhere. In workplaces, in families, in lifelong friendships. One person wakes up and the other refuses to open their eyes. But this isn't cruelty, it's timing. One soul has turned inward while another is still searching outward, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let the distance form so the truth has room to echo. You didn't walk away, you just stopped walking in circles. The friendship didn't end with anger. It ended with awakening. The ones who knew you in your brokenness may not follow you into your wholeness. There comes a strange moment in your growth when silence becomes more powerful than any explanation. You stop playing the part they assigned you, and suddenly the room changes. People grow cold, confused, maybe even cruel. Why? because you've interrupted the system they didn't realize they built around you. Carl Jung warned us long ago. We unconsciously adopt roles to survive in groups, roles like the fixer, the entertainer, the peacekeeper, or the invisible one. These aren't just habits, they're masks forged by our need for acceptance. But the deeper you step into your own consciousness, the heavier those masks become. Eventually, they crack. Take Jonah, for example. He was always the dependable one. At work, he stayed late, took on extra tasks, made others look good without asking for credit. At home, he was the emotional sponge, absorbing his siblings' outbursts, his mother's guilt, his father's silence. He never said no, never caused waves. Everyone praised his calm and selflessness. But one day, Jonah snapped, not with anger, but with clarity. He declined a late-night assignment. He ignored a guilt-tripping message. He stayed quiet during a family fight, not out of fear, but because it wasn't his job to fix them anymore, and that's when the backlash came. His boss accused him of being difficult. His mother called him cold. His friends said he was changing. But in truth, Jonah had simply stopped feeding the system, and the system panicked. Jung explained this shift as part of individuation, the psychological process where a person becomes truly whole. In doing so, you withdraw your unconscious participation in collective dynamics, and that withdrawal feels to others like betrayal. But it's not betrayal, it's liberation. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, Jung said, to avoid facing their own souls. When you step out of your assigned role, those around you are left facing themselves, and many aren't ready for that mirror. You stop laughing at jokes you no longer find funny. You stop pretending to agree. You stop being the emotional janitor. And in the quiet that follows, they don't hear peace. They hear the echo of their own unresolved selves. Here lies the dramatic irony. They say you've changed, but what's really changed is their ability to avoid themselves. You were the cushion, the scapegoat, the distraction, and now that you're gone, the spotlight turns inward. The silence you leave behind is not absence, it's confrontation. It forces them to ask, what part of me needed them to stay small for me to feel safe? But this transformation isn't easy. There will be moments where you feel guilt for no longer rescuing everyone, moments where you feel selfish for saying no, moments where you long to shrink again, just to make the discomfort stop. This is the unconscious pull of the archetype you once embodied, the caregiver, the jester, the ghost. But your soul has chosen a new archetype now, the self, the integrated being who no longer trades authenticity for approval. There's a cost to this kind of honesty. Some people will resent your boundaries because they reveal their own lack of them. Others will label your peace as distance, but don't mistake discomfort for danger. You're not doing harm by stepping back. You're ending your role in a drama that never belonged to you. In this space, something new begins to stir. A stillness, a strength, a knowing. You're no longer the actor. You're the author. And that changes everything. You're not losing people. You're losing the roles that once cost you your truth. There's a kind of grief that creeps in silently, not when someone else leaves your life, but when you do, not your body, not your presence, but the version of you that knew exactly how to belong. The you who knew how to shrink just enough to fit into uncomfortable rooms. The you who laughed at jokes that weren't funny, said yes when you meant no, played the peacemaker while your own heart burned in silence. And one day, without warning, that version of you disappears. You wake up, sit among familiar faces, and suddenly everything feels foreign. You're not angry, you're not better, you're just elsewhere. Carl Jung warned that growth doesn't always feel like glory. It often feels like loss. This is what he called individuation, the painful yet essential process of becoming your true self by shedding the false layers you once wore for protection, and those layers weren't fake. They were necessary. They helped you survive in families that didn't understand you, schools that punished difference, jobs that rewarded obedience over honesty. But survival isn't the same as being alive. The moment you begin choosing authenticity over approval, the mourning begins. Not for others, but for the role you no longer want to play. Consider this story. A woman named Tara worked at a high-pressure corporate firm for 11 years. She was the reliable one, always early, always helpful, always silent in meetings when the CEO made sexist comments. People called her the glue. She wore that label like armor until the weight of it shattered her health. After a minor panic attack in the office elevator, she saw a therapist who introduced her to Jung's ideas about the persona, the social mask we wear to survive. For the first time, Tara saw that her identity had been built entirely around making others comfortable. When she finally quit, her co-workers were shocked, not because she left, but because she left without asking permission. And then came the unexpected wave, not joy, but sorrow. Tara cried not because she missed the job, but because she didn't know who she was outside of it. That version of her, the one everyone leaned on, no longer existed, and there was no welcome party for the real Tara emerging beneath the rubble. Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Because to do that, you must bury the part of you that the world applauded, you must become invisible, for a while, to become visible to yourself again." This is the paradox of inner growth. You feel lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because you're not carrying the old expectations anymore. Heavier because you're now carrying your truth. The places you used to go now feel hollow. The people you used to laugh with feel distant. Even the music you once danced to feels like someone else's playlist. That isn't depression, it's recalibration. Your soul is tuning itself to a new frequency, and the static in between sounds like sadness. And here's the twist. The disconnection you feel is not always from others. Sometimes it's from the version of you that you no longer know how to be. The one who cracked jokes to avoid depth. The one who drank too much to avoid silence. The one who overachieved just to feel worthy. That version is gone, but their ghost lingers. They whisper at night. Maybe go back. Maybe blend in again. But you can't, because now you've seen who you could be, and the mask no longer fits. Jung believed that healing is not becoming someone new. It's remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. But remembering requires grief. And that grief can feel like betrayal of your family, your culture, your past self. But it's not betrayal, it's release. It's the letting go of a survival pattern that's finally outlived its usefulness. You are not what has happened to you. You are what you choose to become, Jung said. But no one tells you that choosing to become also means choosing to let go. And that's the silent heartbreak of self-discovery. You're not just leaving people, you're leaving the self you once had to be to stay close to them. They didn't hate you. They just didn't know what to do with the version of you that stopped pretending. That's the hidden pain of growth, not being rejected, but being misunderstood by the very people you once trusted with your truth. It doesn't come with drama or betrayal. It often comes quietly. A shift in tone, a sudden silence in the group chat, a joke that doesn't land anymore. They don't confront you. They just withdraw. You stand there, trying to explain that you're not angry, not better than them, not trying to distance yourself. You're just becoming someone else. Someone closer to who you really are. And Carl Jung would say, this is not a problem, it's a threshold. A moment where your transformation threatens the stability of those who haven't yet started their own. Jung called this process individuation, the psychological journey toward wholeness. It's not rebellion, it's not selfishness, it's the soul pulling you inward to integrate all the parts you've ignored. But here's the twist. Your evolution will disturb people who depend on your old self to feel stable, especially those who are still deeply embedded in their persona, the mask they wear, to keep life predictable. When your mask cracks, theirs feels threatened. And rather than face that discomfort, they label you distant, moody, arrogant, not like before. Consider the story of Julian, a long-time manager at a mid-sized firm who was always the cheerful problem solver. He smoothed over conflicts, made others laugh, stayed late to cover for co-workers who didn't pull their weight. Everyone loved Julian, but they loved the version of him who never said no. One year, Julian went through therapy. He began journaling, learning about projection, shadow, and personal boundaries. He started saying no. He stopped over-explaining. He let silence stretch where he used to rush in with reassurance. And slowly, people began treating him like a stranger. "You're just not the same anymore," one colleague muttered. But Julian was the same. He had just stopped hiding who he was. He had stopped feeding the dysfunction. Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And what he didn't say, but what life proves, is that others will fear your self-acceptance even more than you do, because your wholeness exposes the fragments they've carefully concealed. If you once played the clown, your silence makes people nervous. If you were the peacekeeper, your boundaries feel like betrayal. And if you were the easy listener, your new assertiveness feels like aggression. It's not because you've become difficult, it's because you've stopped playing their role. The tragic irony is that in becoming more authentic, you may be seen as less familiar. You might feel lonelier after healing than you did while pretending. But that loneliness isn't regression, it's recalibration. It means your soul is no longer compatible with surface-level connection. It's an awkward in-between, too real for the old tribe, not yet aligned with the new one. And in this space, you may be tempted to go back, to water yourself down, to apologize for evolving, to soften your truth until it's palatable again. But beware of this temptation. Jung believed the unconscious always seeks wholeness, even if the conscious mind resists. If you shrink yourself again, your psyche will revolt. You'll feel it in your body: fatigue, frustration, depression, anxiety. These are not random symptoms. They are protest signals from the parts of you that have finally been awakened. They refuse to go back to sleep. You may try explaining your journey to people. You may try clarifying that you're not angry. Just clearer, not cold, just calmer. Not distant, just deeper. But they may still misread you. And that is the true cost of individuation. You will outgrow explanations. Not because you're too good, but because your energy no longer needs external validation to feel whole. The power of being misunderstood lies in this. If you can survive being mislabeled and still stay aligned with your truth, you've crossed one of the most sacred thresholds of the self. Because you're not just growing anymore, you're protecting what you've grown into. And in time, those who are meant to walk with you will recognize your clarity, not as a threat, but as a light they're finally ready to follow. They don't need to understand you for you to be free, but you must understand yourself enough to walk alone. There comes a moment, silent, almost invisible, when your own voice finally begins to return. Not the voice you trained to please others, not the one you rehearsed in mirrors to avoid conflict, but the one you buried long ago, the one you feared was too much, too soft, too honest. It starts like a whisper inside you, often after you've survived the aching quiet of disconnection. This voice is not loud, but it is clear. And its clarity pierces through the fog of roles, masks, and approval-seeking. Carl Jung believed that this emergence of the true voice is the compass of the soul. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But that privilege only awakens after you've stripped away who you were pretending to be. Imagine a man named Marcus, a well-liked team leader at a successful marketing firm. Everyone called him the glue of the team because he kept the peace. He never challenged bad ideas. He smoothed over every conflict. He stayed late, laughed at every joke, picked up the pieces when others failed. But something began to shift. He started therapy after a quiet breakdown in a parking lot where his hands wouldn't stop shaking. The therapist asked him, "When was the last time you said what you really felt?" Marcus couldn't answer because he didn't know. Slowly, over months, he began to hear that forgotten voice inside him, the one that didn't want to be agreeable all the time, the one that had opinions, the one that sometimes wanted to say no. Then came the meeting, a strategy session with the same team he'd carried for years. A junior executive proposed a plan that Marcus knew would fail. Normally, he'd nod and stay silent. But this time he said, "I disagree." The room froze. It was the first time anyone had heard him speak with that kind of quiet authority. Some looked surprised. One person smirked. Another rolled their eyes. But Marcus didn't flinch. That moment cost him something. One teammate stopped inviting him to lunch. Another called him difficult in passing, but it also gave him something back, his own integrity. This is the paradox of returning to your voice. At first, it doesn't feel empowering. It feels dangerous, like you're betraying a script everyone agreed you'd stick to. You may lose friends. You may be misunderstood. But Jung warned that the price of staying silent is far greater than the discomfort of being real. When you live behind a persona, you don't just lose your authenticity, you lose access to your own inner guidance. Your dreams become vague. Your energy dulls. Life feels like performance art. Returning to your voice means reclaiming your compass. It means daring to say, "This is what I see, this is what I feel, this is what I know." There is dramatic irony in this stage of growth. The very people who once praised you for being so easy to work with now accuse you of being hard to approach. Not because you've become cruel, but because you're no longer predictable. Predictability is comforting to others, but your soul wasn't built for comfort, it was built for truth, and truth has a frequency. Once you start vibrating at it, you will no longer be able to tolerate environments, relationships, or conversations that run on pretense. You will crave something deeper, and the more you honor this voice, the more it becomes your compass through life's complexity. You'll notice you speak differently. Now you pause before reacting. You say no without guilt. You don't over-explain your choices. Not because you're rude, but because your voice no longer needs to audition for love. The performance ends. The connection that comes next is different. It's slower, quieter, more real. New people arrive, not drawn to your performance, but to your presence. They don't want the version of you that entertained or accommodated. They want the version that listens inward first. This is the beginning of sacred friendships, of soul-deep belonging. It's also the beginning of solitude, not loneliness, but the ability to be alone without feeling abandoned. Because your voice is now your companion. It tells you when to rest, when to speak, when to walk away, when to stay. You trust it because it no longer lies to make others comfortable. Jung called this alignment individuation, the process of becoming a whole person, not a fractured set of roles, not a crowd of masks, but a unified self centered in its own authority. The story of Marcus doesn't end with applause. His transformation wasn't celebrated with a promotion or standing ovation. But 6 months later, a new employee approached him and said, "I've never heard someone say what they really think in here. It helped me say something I've been holding back." That is the ripple effect of a true voice. It gives silent permission to others who are still pretending. And so, the disconnection you feared becomes something else entirely. It becomes the gate to the kind of connection you never knew existed. Not the kind that needs constant validation, but the kind that exists in presence, truth, and resonance. What once felt like loneliness becomes the silence where your real self begins to speak again. There comes a night, quiet, ordinary, when a strange dream visits you. You're walking through your childhood home, but the pictures on the wall are blank. The voices sound familiar, but no one calls your name. You try to speak, but your mouth won't move. You wake up disturbed, not from fear, but from recognition. Something in you knows. This isn't just a dream, this is a message. Carl Jung believed dreams are not random images, but symbolic messages from the unconscious, fragments of truth that the conscious mind isn't ready to face in daylight. And often, when we begin to feel disconnected from people, places, and even old identities, the first sign doesn't come from the outer world, it comes from a dream, a shift in the symbolic language of the soul. Jung called this stage the early phase of individuation, the deep psychological process, where the self begins to separate from the mask, from the tribe, from the roles we were trained to play. In this phase, the unconscious begins to whisper through metaphor and imagery. You may dream of wandering a city where no one sees you, or of trying to climb a staircase that never ends, or of finding yourself in a room where everyone is laughing, but you can't remember why you're there. These are not nightmares. They are not signs of mental illness. They are signs of psychological movement, of a deeper truth surfacing from within. I once heard of a man named Darren. He was a well-liked teacher, always optimistic, always on. But for months, he had recurring dreams of standing at the front of a classroom, talking passionately, only to look out and see no students, just empty chairs. The dream unsettled him, and slowly he realized he was no longer speaking from a place of truth. His teaching had become performance. His words, once filled with soul, were now polished echoes of what others wanted to hear. His unconscious had revealed it before his waking mind caught up. He was drifting from his own authenticity. He wasn't burned out. He was misaligned. This is the mystery of Jung's dream work, what he called the royal road to the unconscious. Our psyche often begins the process of letting go before we have the language to admit it. A woman once dreamed of returning to her high school reunion, only to find all her old friends wearing masks. They spoke kindly, but their voices were hollow. She felt invisible, but strangely peaceful. The dream ended with her walking out into the night and hearing her own name for the first time in years. She cried when she woke up, not because she was sad, but because the dream spoke a truth she hadn't dared to. Her time in that circle was over. She had changed, and her dream had freed her before her conscious mind dared to. Jung wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." But ironically, it is through dreams that the inside begins to rise. The dream world is where your persona, the social mask, fades and yourself steps into view. In dreams, you don't need permission to transform. You don't need applause to evolve. You simply experience what your soul already knows. And if you pay attention, the dream will show you what must be released and what must be reclaimed. So if your dreams are shifting, if the old symbols no longer comfort you, if you wake up with a strange sense of distance, you are not regressing, you are preparing. The disconnection you feel in waking life may only be the echo of what your unconscious already began in the dark. The letting go, the truth-telling, the inner revolution. And one day, when your conscious mind finally catches up, you'll realize the dream didn't confuse you, it called you, it summoned the real you forward before you were ready to see. Your dreams are trying to prepare you for the next stage of your individuation. They show you what must be released, who must be faced, what truth must finally be spoken. Your disconnection is not always from the world. It may be the soul waking up before the ego is ready to follow. You can be healing, growing, and evolving, and still feel like no one notices. That's the quiet agony of inner progress. It doesn't make noise. It doesn't demand attention, and to the outside world, it often looks like nothing. No applause, no milestones, no big announcements. Just you, sitting in silence, doing the deep work. Reading, journaling, forgiving, resisting old patterns, facing your shadow. But here's the hook. What if the people closest to you can't even tell? What if, despite all your effort, they still treat you like the version of you that no longer exists? Carl Jung believed that true change begins in the unconscious, and what begins there often goes unseen by those who aren't looking deeply. That's why your calm may be mistaken for coldness. Your new boundaries may be labeled selfish. Your detachment from drama might come across as arrogance because what you've done, quietly and without ceremony, is withdraw from the collective projection that once defined you. And people, especially loved ones, don't just miss the old you, they depend on that old version to maintain their own psychological balance. Imagine a man named Elias. For years, Elias was the emotional sponge of his family, the fixer, the helper, the one who made peace when others fought. Every Thanksgiving, he'd mediate his brother's tension, distract his mother with jokes, and hold back his own sadness so the mood wouldn't drop. But then something shifted. Elias began reading Jung. He learned about the persona, the social mask he wore for years, and more importantly, he discovered the shadow, the anger, resentment, and weariness he had buried to be the good one. He started therapy. He began saying no. He stopped answering every late-night call. He started protecting his energy. But instead of being seen as stronger, his family whispered that he had changed. They said he was withdrawing. One cousin told him, "You used to care more." But what really happened was this. Elias stopped betraying himself to play a role that served others' avoidance. His growth had made him invisible, not because he wasn't real, but because he was no longer performing the script they had written for him. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Elias had interrupted that fate, but no one clapped. No one said thank you, because the role he broke free from was never meant to be questioned. This is the cruel irony. The more real you become, the less recognizable you might be to the people who only ever saw your mask. And when you don't yell, don't explain, don't overperform, that silence can be deafening to others, especially those who measure love by noise, performance, or proximity. Jung often wrote that individuation, the journey toward your true self, is not loud. It's not a billboard, it's a whisper. And that whisper is often drowned out by the expectations of the group. This is where projection cuts both ways. Just as we project parts of ourselves onto others, others project roles onto us. The listener, the quiet one, the strong one. And when we step out of those roles, the entire emotional system tilts. They feel abandoned, but they're not mourning you. They're mourning the control your role gave them. A friend once told me, "I lost people not because I changed, but because I stopped making them comfortable." This is the wound of invisible progress. Knowing you're becoming better, but watching people treat you like you're disappearing. Healing becomes lonely. Progress feels like punishment. You wonder if it's worth it. You wonder if maybe the mask was easier. But something deeper inside knows. Going back would be the real betrayal. Jung believed every act of self-remembering was a rebellion against unconscious living, and rebels don't get applause, they get misunderstood. Still, your progress is not measured by who claps. It's measured by your ability to witness yourself, to know, without needing proof, that you are not who you used to be. And that's enough, even if the people you love never notice, even if they misread your silence as distance, even if they never ask what you're becoming. Because the real shift happened in you, not in their perception. Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." That's what you're doing, step by invisible step, and not everyone is ready to see that. But you are. So keep going. Keep shedding the layers that kept you digestible to others, but distant from yourself. Even if no one sees the steps you've taken, walk them anyway, because the one person who needs to witness your progress is you. There's a moment, quiet but undeniable, when you realize the most neglected relationship in your life is the one you have with yourself. It doesn't come with fanfare. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives in the echo of disconnection, after the noise fades and the applause stops, after the friendships grow thin and the masks you once wore no longer feel like protection, but confinement. This is when you hear it, the whisper beneath the silence. It's not loneliness. It's your soul calling you back. Carl Jung taught that individuation, the process of becoming whole, is not about separating from others, but about reintegrating with the forgotten parts of the self. The inner child you silenced to survive. The teenager who made himself likable to be loved. The adult who traded self-respect for social approval. These aren't just phases of your past. They're fragments of you waiting to be reclaimed. And oddly enough, disconnection from others often becomes the portal through which this inner reunion begins. Consider this. A man named Julian had always been the reliable one. He was there for every friend's crisis, every family emergency, every workplace gap that needed filling. But when he finally said no, when he finally honored his need for rest, he noticed his phone stopped ringing. The same people who praised his loyalty disappeared when his boundaries showed up. At first, it devastated him. But one night, sitting alone on his porch, something shifted. For the first time in years, he realized he didn't feel anxious. He didn't feel like performing. He didn't need to be needed to feel valuable. I sat with myself, he told his therapist, and for the first time in my life, I didn't want to escape. Jung would say Julian was beginning the return, not to who he used to be, but to who he was beneath all the roles. Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart, who looks outside, dreams, who looks inside, awakes. The more you look inward, the more you awaken parts of you that were buried by adaptation, the wild parts, the tender parts, the intuitive parts. Not everything you find will be pretty. Some of it is the shadow, the parts you rejected. But it's yours. And as you reclaim it, you become more whole. Not perfect, not polished, but real. There's irony here. You thought losing people meant you were failing, but what if it meant you were finally listening? You thought silence meant emptiness. But what if it was making space for truth? You thought the absence of others meant something was wrong. But maybe it meant the reunion was about to begin. You don't need a crowd to find your truth. You need solitude brave enough to let the real you speak, so the next time you feel that strange pull away from the world, don't panic. That may be the soul's invitation. Not into isolation, but into integration, into deeper honesty, into a slower rhythm, into the relationship you abandoned to fit in with people who never saw you. When you are no longer afraid of your own company, disconnection turns into reunion. There comes a moment in the quiet of your room, when your phone doesn't ring, when the group chat feels colder, when no one seems to notice the new version of you emerging, and you wonder, am I doing something wrong? But what if the silence isn't punishment? What if it's progress? Carl Jung believed that growth often begins in the dark, where the ego loses its grip and the true self begins to rise. Disconnection, he taught, isn't failure. It's the first sign that your soul has stopped conforming. This phase is not loud, it's not a breakdown, it's more subtle, more haunting, like walking through a familiar house and noticing the pictures on the wall don't feel like yours anymore. The furniture is the same. The people might still be kind, but something in you has turned. You're more alert now. You see through things you once accepted. You feel conversations growing hollow. You sense energy that once comforted you, now drains you, and no one clapped when this happened. No one celebrated it, because transformation doesn't throw a party, it closes a door. Jung warned, loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. You can be surrounded by smiles and still feel invisible. Because once your values shift, your voice does too. You start speaking truths others aren't ready to hear. You say no to patterns you use to enable you, withdraw from gossip, from small talk, from roles that once won you approval. And the world doesn't applaud. It stares, it questions, it judges. Because when you outgrow the persona, you threaten the comfort of those still wearing theirs. Imagine this. A woman named Arya has always been the glue of her friend group. She listens. She fixes. She laughs on cue. But something changes. After years of burying her needs, she begins journaling. She sets boundaries. She says no. The friends who once praised her for being so easygoing now whisper that she's distant. One even says, "You've changed." And she has. But not in the way they mean. She hasn't become cold, she's become whole. She's peeling off the layers of performance to reveal a self that's always been there, waiting. Jung called this process individuation, the integration of shadow, persona, and true self into one conscious being. It's not comfortable. It doesn't guarantee applause. But it's the only path to real freedom. Disconnection is a symptom of this path, because the deeper you go, the fewer people can follow. You're not rejecting them, you're just not willing to abandon yourself anymore, and that's what scares them. Your presence now holds a mirror, and not everyone is ready to see what's inside it. Dramatic irony sets in here. The same people who once called you strong now say you're selfish. The ones who once admired your loyalty now resent your independence. What they don't realize is that this isn't rebellion, it's return. You are returning to yourself, and that journey is sacred. It's lonely, yes, but not empty. Because as you walk this quieter road, something strange begins to happen. You hear a voice you haven't heard in years, your own. You begin to find people who don't need your mask to feel safe. People who speak in depth, not defense. People who've made the same lonely walk and now sit in their own stillness, waiting not to save you, but to welcome you. These aren't your old crowd. They are your new mirrors, your new tribe. People who've cried in silence, walked through shadow, and still chose truth over comfort. So if you've felt disconnected lately, like no one gets you, like you're floating above old lives, you're not broken, you're becoming. Carl Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." This is the cost of becoming more conscious. You'll notice what others don't. You'll say no when others nod yes. You'll crave depth when others settle for surface. And you'll lose people, but you'll gain yourself. In time, you'll meet others walking the same quiet road. People who've peeled off their masks, too. People who've faced the shadow and still chose light. You're not alone. You're just early. Keep going. Keep unfolding. Because the goal is not to reconnect with everyone you once knew. It's to reconnect with the person you were always meant to be. Disconnection isn't the end of your story. It's the portal into your truth.